The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face as Penelope Zimmerman stirred the beans in her tin pot, unaware that death was closing in around her with the silence of approaching nightfall. She had been traveling alone for 3 weeks now, making her way from Kansas City to Stillwater, Oklahoma, where her uncle had promised her work in his general store, and the isolation of the prairie had become as familiar to her as breathing. The year was 1876, and women did not typically make such journeys without escorts, but Penelope had little choice after her father's business collapsed and her mother passed from consumption. At 22 years old, she had learned to be resourceful, to read the land, to keep her rifle close, and to trust her instincts above all else. Tonight, however, her instincts had failed her. She became aware of them gradually, the way one becomes aware of a storm building on the horizon. First, there was the feeling of being watched, then the soft crunch of boots on dried grass, then the unmistakable sound of men breathing in the darkness just beyond her fire's reach. Penelope's hand moved slowly toward her rifle, which leaned against her saddle 3 feet away, but before her fingers could close around the wooden stock, a voice cut through the night. "I would not do that if I were you, miss." She froze. 5 men emerged from the shadows, circling her campfire like wolves stalking wounded prey. Their faces were hard and weathered, marked by violence and years of living outside the law. The one who had spoken was tall and lean, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He smiled, revealing teeth stained brown from tobacco. "Now what's a pretty thing like you doing out here all alone?" he asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm traveling to Stillwater. My uncle is expecting me." "Stillwater is still 2 days' ride from here," another man said, this one shorter and stocky with small eyes that glittered in the firelight. "Lot can happen in 2 days." The men laughed, a sound that made Penelope's skin crawl. She calculated her options rapidly. The rifle was too far. She had a knife in her boot, but against 5 armed men, it would be useless. She could scream, but there was no one within miles to hear her. Her wagon and supplies represented everything she owned in the world, but survival mattered more than possessions. "I have money," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Take what you want and leave me be." The scarred man stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face. "Oh, we will take what we want, all right, but money ain't exactly what we had in mind." The other men moved closer, tightening the circle. Penelope's mind raced, searching for any possible escape, any weapon, any advantage. She was reaching for the pot of hot beans, thinking she could at least throw it in someone's face and make a run for it, when the sound of hoofbeats shattered the tension like a gunshot. The men spun around, hands flying to their weapons, as a rider came thundering out of the darkness. The horse was a magnificent paint stallion, black and white against the night sky, and the man on its back rode with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life in the saddle. Before the outlaws could fully react, the rider had driven his horse straight into their circle, scattering them like tumbleweeds in a strong wind. "Get out of here!" he shouted at Penelope, his voice carrying absolute authority. But Penelope was not the type to run blindly. She grabbed her rifle and rolled behind her wagon as gunfire erupted. The rider was fast, faster than any man she had ever seen. He fired twice, and 2 of the outlaws dropped before the others could get their bearings. The scarred man aimed at the rider, but Penelope fired first, her bullet catching him in the shoulder. He howled and stumbled backward. The remaining 2 outlaws decided they had had enough. They ran for their horses, mounted quickly, and disappeared into the darkness, leaving their wounded companion behind. The scarred man clutched his shoulder and glared at Penelope with pure hatred before staggering after his fleeing companions, vanishing into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. Penelope's ears rang from the gunfire, and her hands shook as she lowered her rifle. The rider dismounted in one smooth motion and walked toward her slowly, his hands visible and unthreatening. "You all right, miss?" he asked. In the firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that fell to his collar and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with strong features and a jaw that suggested both stubbornness and determination. He wore the typical garb of a working cowboy, worn denims, a leather vest over a blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. A silver star was pinned to his vest. "I'm fine," Penelope managed, though her voice trembled slightly. "Thank you. If you had not arrived when you did—" "Best not to think about that," he interrupted gently. He holstered his revolver and offered her a slight nod of respect. "Name is Thomas Quinlan. I'm a deputy marshal out of Guthrie. I've been tracking that gang for 2 weeks." "Penelope Zimmerman," she replied, lowering her rifle completely. "I'm traveling to Stillwater." Thomas glanced at her wagon, her small campfire, the evidence of her solitary journey, and something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "That's a long way to travel alone, Miss Zimmerman, especially with men like that roaming the territory." "I did not have much choice in the matter," Penelope said, bristling slightly at the implied criticism. "And I can take care of myself." A smile tugged at the corner of Thomas's mouth. "I saw that. That was a fine shot you made. Probably saved my life." The acknowledgement caught Penelope off guard. Men rarely gave women credit for anything requiring skill or courage. She found herself looking at this deputy marshal with new interest. "I grew up on a farm," she explained. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. He said a woman needed to know how to protect herself and her property." "Your father was a wise man," Thomas said. He walked to his horse and retrieved his canteen, taking a long drink before offering it to Penelope. She accepted it gratefully, suddenly aware of how parched her throat had become. "Will they come back?" she asked, handing the canteen back to him. Thomas considered the question seriously. "Not tonight. You wounded their leader and I killed 2 of their gang. They will want to lick their wounds and regroup. But I would not recommend you continuing alone." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I am headed to Stillwater myself. I need to report to the local sheriff about this gang's activities. If you would accept the company, I would be happy to escort you the rest of the way." Penelope's first instinct was to refuse. She had learned to be independent, to rely on herself alone, but she was also practical enough to recognize that pride could get her killed. Those men knew where she was, and even wounded, they outnumbered her. Having a deputy marshal as an escort was probably the smartest decision she could make. "I would appreciate that, Marshal Quinlan," she said formally. "Just Thomas," he corrected with another of those small smiles. "And may I call you Penelope?" "You may." They settled the arrangements quickly. Thomas would make his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire, giving her privacy and space. They would start early in the morning, traveling together until they reached Stillwater. The conversation was practical and brief, but Penelope found herself stealing glances at him as he tended to his horse and laid out his blankets. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, something that went beyond the simple fact of his badge and his gun. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks, knowing someone was keeping watch. They broke camp at dawn, when the sky was still purple and gold at the edges. Thomas helped her hitch her horse to the wagon without being asked, and Penelope found herself noticing the strength in his hands, the easy competence with which he handled the leather straps and buckles. They fell into a comfortable traveling rhythm, with Thomas riding alongside her wagon, occasionally ranging ahead to scout the trail. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, they began to talk. At first, the conversation was cautious, the polite exchanges of strangers, but gradually, as the miles passed beneath them, they began to share more. "My father died 6 months ago," Penelope found herself saying, surprised by her own willingness to confide in this man. "His shipping business failed after the Panic of '73. He never recovered from it, not really. My mother passed 2 months after him. The doctor said it was consumption, but I think it was a broken heart." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "I am sorry. That is a heavy burden for anyone to carry." "What about you?" Penelope asked, wanting to shift the focus away from her own grief. "How did you become a deputy marshal?" Thomas's expression grew distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the horizon. "My family had a ranch in Texas near Austin. I was the youngest of 4 boys. My father expected my older brothers to run the ranch, so I was free to find my own path. I always had a sense of right and wrong, I suppose. Could not stand by when I saw injustice happening. When I was 20, some rustlers killed my eldest brother during a cattle drive. The local law did not seem particularly interested in finding the men responsible, so I tracked them down myself. Did you find them? Penelope asked softly. I did. Brought them back to stand trial. The judge was impressed enough to recommend me for a deputy position. I have been wearing a badge ever since. Do you ever regret it? The life of a lawman seems dangerous. Thomas looked at her directly, and Penelope felt the full weight of his attention. I regret that there is so much lawlessness requiring lawmen, but no, I do not regret the work. Someone has to stand between decent people and those who would prey on them. Might as well be me. There was a fundamental decency to this man, Penelope realized. It was not just the badge he wore or the gun on his hip. It was something deeper, a core of integrity that governed his actions. She found herself trusting him in a way she had not trusted anyone since her father's death. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Penelope sat on the lowered tailgate of her wagon while Thomas stood nearby, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She watched him, this quiet guardian who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. Do you think those men are still out there? She asked. Almost certainly, Thomas replied. But they are wounded and wary now. They know I am hunting them. That makes them more dangerous in some ways, but also more cautious. Have you always worked alone? Mostly. Sometimes I partner with other deputies when we are tracking a particularly large gang. But generally, I prefer to work solo. Makes things simpler. Does not it get lonely? The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He turned to look at her, and something vulnerable flickered across his features before his usual calm mask settled back into place. Sometimes, he admitted, but lonely is better than being responsible for getting a partner killed. I've seen that happen too many times. Penelope understood that sentiment all too well. After losing both her parents in such quick succession, she had built walls around her heart, telling herself that independence was safer than attachment. But sitting here in the vast Oklahoma prairie, with this steady, honest man standing watch over her, those walls felt less necessary than they had before. They traveled through the afternoon, and as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Thomas spotted a small creek with good grass for the horses. They made camp there, and this time Thomas helped Penelope gather firewood and set up her cooking area without being asked. She made a simple stew with salt pork and beans, and they ate together as the stars began to appear overhead. Tell me about Stillwater, Thomas said as they finished their meal. What are you hoping to find there? Stability, I suppose, Penelope answered honestly. My uncle owns a general store. He has offered me a position as a clerk in a room above the shop. It is not grand, but it is a new start, a chance to build something of my own. You strike me as someone who would be good at that, Thomas observed. Building things, I mean. You have grit. Penelope felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. What about you? Will you stay in Stillwater long? Depends on where the trail leads with this gang. I will need to file my report with the local sheriff, see if there have been other incidents in the area. Could be a few days, could be a week. He paused, then added with unusual hesitancy, Would you mind if I called on you while I'm in town, just to make sure you're settling in all right? Penelope's heart skipped in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I would like that very much, she said quietly. Their eyes met across the fire, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of a connection forming, tentative and new, but undeniably real. Thomas was the first to look away, but Penelope caught the hint of a smile on his lips. That night, as she lay in her bedroll and listened to the sounds of the prairie, Penelope found herself thinking not about the attack or the dangers of the journey, but about the quiet strength of the man sleeping on the other side of the dying fire. She had not expected to meet anyone like Thomas Quinlan on this journey. She had not expected to feel this flutter of hope in her chest, this cautious opening of possibilities she had thought were closed to her forever. The next day brought them within sight of Stillwater. The town sat in a shallow valley, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, with farms and homesteads spreading out into the surrounding prairie. It was not large, perhaps 300 souls, but it had the look of a place that was growing, establishing itself as part of the new Oklahoma Territory. As they rode down the main street, Penelope felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. This was to be her new home, the place where she would rebuild her life. Thomas rode beside her wagon, and she found comfort in his presence, even knowing that their journey together was coming to an end. Zimmerman's General Store stood on the corner of Main Street and First Avenue, a two-story building with a wide front porch and large windows displaying goods. Before Penelope could even set the wagon's brake, a man emerged from the store, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Penelope," he called out, "thank the Lord you made it safely." Her uncle Harold Zimmerman was a round man in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and spectacles perched on his nose. He hurried down the steps and helped Penelope from the wagon seat, enveloping her in a brief but warm embrace. "I was so worried," he said, stepping back to look at her. "When your letter said you were traveling alone, I nearly sent someone to meet you halfway." "I am fine, Uncle Harold," Penelope assured him. She gestured to Thomas, who had dismounted and stood respectfully back. "Though I might not have been if not for Marshal Quinlan. He rescued me from some outlaws and escorted me safely here." Harold's expression shifted to alarm and then gratitude. He extended his hand to Thomas, shaking it vigorously. "Marshal, I cannot thank you enough. If anything had happened to my niece—" "She handled herself well," Thomas interrupted, his tone making it clear he was not just offering empty platitudes. "She's quite capable with a rifle." Harold looked surprised and then proud. "Her father taught her well." He turned back to Penelope. "Come, let me show you your room and help you get settled. Marshal, will you join us for supper tonight? It is the least we can offer for your service." Thomas glanced at Penelope, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and warmth spread through his features. "I would be honored, sir. I need to report to the sheriff first, but I will return in a few hours if that suits." "Perfect," Harold said, already ushering Penelope toward the store. "We eat at 6. As Thomas led his horse toward the sheriff's office, Penelope found herself watching him go, already anticipating his return. Her room above the store was small but clean, with a single window overlooking Main Street, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. It was more than she had dared hope for after months of uncertainty. Harold gave her time to wash and change into a fresh dress, one of the few nice things she still owned, a deep blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Harold's wife, Aunt Margaret, was a bustling woman with kind eyes and quick hands. She had prepared a roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, and the smell filled the small apartment above the store where they lived. When Thomas arrived promptly at 6, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing, Margaret ushered him in with the same warmth she had shown Penelope. Over dinner, Thomas gave a more detailed account of the attack and the gang he had been tracking. Harold listened with growing concern, asking questions about whether the town was in danger. Thomas was honest but reassuring, explaining that the gang typically preyed on isolated travelers rather than established settlements. "Still," Harold said thoughtfully, "perhaps we should organize a town watch, at least until these men are caught." "That would not be a bad idea," Thomas agreed. "I will be coordinating with Sheriff Donovan. If we can track down where they are hiding, we can end this threat permanently." As the meal progressed, Penelope found herself relaxing in a way she had not in months. The food was good, the company was warm, and Thomas fit seamlessly into the family atmosphere, answering questions about his work and asking thoughtful questions in return. Margaret clearly approved of the young marshal, shooting meaningful glances at Penelope that made her blush. After dinner, Thomas helped clear the table despite Margaret's protests, and then asked Penelope if she would like to take a walk. Harold and Margaret exchanged knowing looks but said nothing, simply waving them off with smiles. The evening air was cool and pleasant as they walked down Main Street. Most of the shops had closed for the day, and families were gathered in their homes for the evening. A few people nodded greetings as they passed, curious about the stranger with the marshal's badge, but too polite to intrude. "Your uncle and aunt are good people," Thomas said as they walked. "You will be happy here, I think." "I hope so," Penelope replied. "It feels strange to be starting over, but also right somehow, like maybe this is where I'm supposed to be." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again, his voice more hesitant than usual. "Penelope, I know we have only known each other for 2 days, but I feel I should be honest with you. I cannot remember the last time I enjoyed someone's company the way I have enjoyed yours. I would very much like to call on you properly, if you would allow it." Penelope's heart raced, but her voice was steady when she answered, "I would like that, Thomas, very much." They had reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The sun had set, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and deep blue. They stood there together, looking out at the vast expanse of land, and Penelope felt Thomas's hand brush against hers. She took a small breath and interlaced her fingers with his. His hand was warm and strong, and the simple contact sent electricity through her entire body. "I need to warn you," Thomas said quietly, still looking at the horizon. "My work is dangerous. There are times I will be gone for weeks, chasing outlaws across the territory. There are times I might not come back at all. That is a hard life for anyone to share." Penelope squeezed his hand gently. "My parents had 25 years together before they died. 25 years of building a life and a family. The end was hard, yes, but those years were good. I would rather have something real and uncertain than something safe and empty." Thomas turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You are remarkable," he said simply. "I am practical," she corrected, but she smiled as she said it. They walked back to the store, slowly, reluctant to let the evening end. At the bottom of the stairs leading to her room, Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply romantic. "I will be in town for at least a few more days," he said. "May I see you tomorrow?" "Yes," Penelope answered without hesitation. She watched him walk away into the darkness, her hand still tingling from his kiss, her heart fuller than it had been in months. The next morning, Penelope began her work at the general store. Harold was a patient teacher, showing her how he organized his inventory, how he kept his accounts, and how he dealt with customers. Penelope absorbed the information quickly, her natural intelligence and business sense making her a fast learner. The store served the local community, providing everything from foodstuffs to fabric, tools to tobacco. Harold explained that he prided himself on fair prices and good service, which had earned him the loyalty of most of the town. Customers came and went throughout the morning, and Penelope enjoyed the interactions. There was Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house and needed flour and sugar. There was old Mr. Hendricks, who spent 10 minutes deciding between 2 different types of tobacco before finally choosing the same brand he always bought. There was Sarah Mitchell, a young mother with 2 children in tow, who smiled warmly at Penelope and welcomed her to Stillwater. At noon, Thomas appeared in the doorway. He had been at the sheriff's office all morning, working on his report and discussing the gang with the local law. Harold saw him first and called out cheerfully, "Marshal Quinlan, come in, come in." Thomas removed his hat as he entered, nodding to Harold before his eyes found Penelope. "Good afternoon. I was wondering if Miss Zimmerman might be able to take a lunch break. There's a small restaurant down the street that serves a decent meal." Harold waved them off with a grin. "Go, go. Business is slow today anyway. Margaret will come down to help me if needed." The restaurant was run by a Chinese family who had come to Oklahoma to work on the railroad and stayed to open a business. The food was a mixture of American and Chinese cuisine, and Thomas ordered for them both, clearly familiar with the establishment. They sat at a small table near the window, and Penelope found herself relaxing into the easy conversation that flowed between them. "How was your first morning of work?" Thomas asked. "Good. Uncle Harold is very organized, and I think I'm going to enjoy the work. It feels good to be useful again, to have a purpose." "And how do you find Stillwater?" "Smaller than I expected, but in a good way. Everyone has been very welcoming." Thomas smiled. "It is a good town. Not perfect, but most people here are decent and hardworking. You will fit in well." They talked about inconsequential things, the kind of conversation that allows 2 people to learn the small details about each other. Penelope learned that Thomas had a weakness for apple pie, that he had once wanted to be a school teacher before deciding on law enforcement, that he could read Latin because his mother had insisted all her sons get a proper education. Thomas learned that Penelope loved to read novels, especially ones about adventure, that she played the piano tolerably well, and that she had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. As they finished their meal, Thomas grew more serious. "I spoke with Sheriff Donovan this morning. There have been 3 other attacks in the area over the past month, all following a similar pattern. The gang targets isolated travelers, takes what they want, and moves on. We think they have a hideout somewhere in the hills to the north." "What will you do?" Penelope asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I will go after them. The sheriff is putting together a small posse. We leave tomorrow at dawn." Penelope felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had known this was coming, had known that Thomas's work would take him into danger, but the reality of it still hit her hard. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be a week or more. Depends on how easy they are to track." Penelope reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Be careful, Thomas, please." He turned his hand over to clasp hers, his thumb rubbing gently across her knuckles. "I will, and I will come back. I promise you that." They spent the afternoon together, walking around Stillwater and its surroundings. Thomas showed her the church, the schoolhouse, the livery stable where he boarded his horse. He introduced her to people they met, always with a tone of respect and genuine warmth that made Penelope feel valued. By the time he walked her back to the store as evening fell, Penelope felt as if she had known this town and this man for years rather than days. At the store entrance, Thomas took both her hands in his. "I wish I had more time before I have to leave. I wish I could spend weeks getting to know you properly." "Then come back safely," Penelope said, her voice fierce despite the emotion making it tremble. "Come back and we will have all the time in the world." Thomas pulled her closer, and for a moment Penelope thought he might kiss her. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, a gesture so intimate and tender that it took her breath away. "I will come back," he whispered. "I have too much to come back to." He left before full dark, needing to prepare for the next day's departure. Penelope stood in the doorway and watched him go, her heart already aching with his absence, even though he had not yet left town. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Penelope stared at the ceiling and tried to quiet her racing thoughts. She had known Thomas Quinlan for barely 3 days, and yet the thought of him riding into danger tomorrow made her chest tight with fear. She told herself she was being foolish, that she barely knew him, that she should guard her heart more carefully. But hearts, she was learning, did not always listen to reason. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses and men's voices in the street below. Unable to help herself, she dressed quickly and went to the window. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see Thomas with Sheriff Donovan and 4 other men, all mounted and armed. They were making final preparations, checking weapons and supplies. As if sensing her gaze, Thomas looked up at her window. Their eyes met across the distance, and even though they could not speak, the connection between them was palpable. Thomas touched the brim of his hat in a small salute, and Penelope raised her hand in farewell. Then the posse rode out, heading north, and Penelope was left watching the empty street as the sun began to rise. The days that followed were difficult. Penelope threw herself into her work at the store, learning everything Harold would teach her and volunteering for extra tasks to keep her mind occupied. Margaret noticed her distraction and worried state, but said nothing, simply offering quiet support and companionship. On the 3rd day, news came that the posse had found the gang's hideout in an abandoned mining camp in the hills. There had been a gunfight. 2 members of the gang were dead, 3 were captured, and the wounded leader had escaped into the wilderness. The posse had split up, with some men escorting the prisoners back to Stillwater, while others, including Thomas, continued tracking the escaped outlaw. Penelope felt sick with worry. She knew the scarred man, knew the hatred in his eyes when she had shot him. He was the kind of man who held grudges, who would want revenge, and Thomas was hunting him through rough territory where anything could happen. On the 5th day, Margaret found Penelope standing at the window of her room, staring at the northern horizon. "Come sit with me," Margaret said gently, leading her to the small sitting area in the apartment. "Let me tell you a story." Penelope sat, grateful for the distraction, and Margaret poured them both tea before settling into her chair with a soft sigh. "When Harold and I married, he was a merchant sailor, gone for months at a time, sailing to ports all over the world. I spent our first 5 years of marriage waiting for him to come home, never knowing if the ship would return, if a storm would take him, if I would be a widow before I turned 30. "How did you bear it?" Penelope asked softly. "I learned that love requires trust, not just trust in the person you love, but trust in life itself. I could have spent those years paralyzed with fear, or I could have lived fully, building a life that Harold would be happy to return to. I chose the latter. And when Harold finally left the sea and we opened this store, I had no regrets about those years. The waiting was hard, but the loving was worth it." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. I barely know him, Aunt Margaret. We have spent 3 days together. Why does it feel like my heart is being torn out? Margaret smiled sadly. Because real connection does not need years to form. Sometimes 2 souls recognize each other instantly. It does not happen often, but when it does, it is powerful and undeniable. On the morning of the 7th day, Penelope was arranging tins on a shelf when the bell over the door chimed. She turned, expecting a customer, and instead saw Thomas standing in the doorway. He was dusty and tired, with a week's worth of beard on his face and exhaustion evident in every line of his body, but he was alive and whole. Penelope did not remember crossing the floor. She only knew that suddenly she was in his arms, and he was holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she did not care. She felt him bury his face in her hair, felt the shudder that went through his body, felt the way his arms trembled as he held her. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "I told you I would," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. Harold appeared from the back room, took one look at them, and quietly retreated, a knowing smile on his face. They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, reassuring themselves of the other's presence. Finally, Thomas pulled back just enough to look at her face. "We got him. He tried to ambush us in a canyon, but we were ready for him. He's in custody now, awaiting trial. The gang is finished." "Were you hurt?" Penelope asked, her hands running over his arms and chest as if checking for injuries. "A few bruises, nothing serious. But Penelope, the whole time I was out there, all I could think about was getting back here, getting back to you." "You need to rest," she said practically, though her heart was singing. "You need food and sleep and—" Thomas stopped her words with a kiss. It was soft and gentle, reverent even, and it felt like a promise. When he pulled back, his eyes were shining. "I love you, Penelope Zimmerman. I know it is too soon to say such things. I know we have barely known each other a week, but it is the truth, and I needed you to know it." Penelope felt joy burst through her like sunrise. "I love you too, Thomas Quinlan. I think I have loved you since you came riding out of the darkness to save me." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Penelope felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. She had thought she would spend her life alone, that she would never trust anyone enough to let them close. But Thomas had shown her that strength could be gentle, that protection did not mean possession, that love could be both fierce and tender. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Thomas said, "I need to file my final report and get cleaned up, but tonight, may I take you to dinner? A proper courting dinner?" "Yes," Penelope said simply. He left reluctantly, and Penelope watched him go with a smile on her face that would not fade. Harold emerged from the back room, grinning like a fool. Well, that was quite a homecoming. "Uncle Harold," Penelope protested, blushing. "I am happy for you, my dear. He is a good man, that Marshal. Your father would have approved." The words touched Penelope deeply. Her father's approval would have mattered, and knowing that Harold thought he would have liked Thomas meant the world to her. That evening, Thomas called for her dressed in his best clothes, his face cleanly shaven and his hair neatly combed. He took her to the nicest restaurant in Stillwater, a small establishment with checkered tablecloths and candles on every table. Over roast beef and potatoes, they talked for hours, filling in the details of their lives, their hopes, their dreams, their fears. They talked about Thomas's work and the dangers it entailed, about Penelope's plans for the store and her desire to make a real home in Stillwater. They talked about family and loss, about the future and what it might hold. "I will not give up my badge," Thomas said at one point, his tone making it clear this was important. "Not unless I am physically unable to do the work anymore. It is who I am." "I would never ask you to," Penelope replied honestly. "I fell in love with you as you are, Thomas. I would not want to change you. But it means there will be times I am away for weeks, times when you will have to manage alone, times when you will worry and wait." Penelope reached across the table and took his hand. "And there will be times when you come home to me, times when we build a life together, times when we are happy. I am willing to take the hard times if it means I get the good times too." Thomas looked at her with such love and gratitude that it took her breath away. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked softly. "We both got lucky," Penelope corrected. "That you were tracking that gang at exactly the right time, that you heard the gunfire, that you rode in when you did. It feels like fate." "Maybe it was," Thomas agreed. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Penelope settled into a pattern of courtship. Thomas had to travel occasionally for his work, but these trips were shorter and less dangerous than his hunt for the gang. When he was in town, he spent every free moment with Penelope. They attended church together on Sundays, walked out on the prairie in the evenings, shared meals with Harold and Margaret, and slowly built the foundation of a life together. The town of Stillwater accepted them as a couple almost immediately. Thomas was respected as a lawman, and Penelope had quickly become popular for her fair dealing and pleasant manner at the store. People began to ask when they would announce their engagement, and Harold started making jokes about needing to build an addition to the store for a married couple. 3 months after they met, on a warm September evening, Thomas took Penelope to a small hill overlooking the town. The prairie grasses were golden in the setting sun, and the air smelled of earth and growing things. They sat together on a blanket, watching the light fade from the sky. "Penelope," Thomas said, his voice serious, "I have something I need to ask you." She turned to look at him, her heart already racing because she knew what was coming. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, she saw a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest but beautiful. "I know we have not known each other long by most standards," Thomas said, "but I know my own heart and I know yours. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I want to spend my life with you, build a home with you, raise children with you. Penelope Zimmerman, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Penelope's face, but she was smiling as she nodded. "Yes, Thomas, yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her with all the passion and love he felt, and Penelope kissed him back with equal fervor, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. They were married 6 weeks later in the Stillwater church, with most of the town in attendance. Penelope wore a dress that Margaret had helped her sew, simple but elegant, and she carried wildflowers that Sarah Mitchell had helped her gather. Thomas wore a new suit and looked so handsome that Penelope could hardly believe he was hers. Harold walked her down the aisle, and when he placed her hand in Thomas's, he whispered, "Your parents would be so proud." The ceremony was traditional and moving, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Penelope with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance openly wept. The reception was held at the boarding house, with food provided by half the town and music played by a small group of local musicians. They danced their first dance as husband and wife to a fiddle tune, and Penelope thought she had never been happier in her entire life. Harold had indeed built a small addition to the store, 3 rooms on the ground floor that would serve as a home for the newlyweds. It was not large, but it was theirs, and Penelope had spent weeks making it comfortable and welcoming. That night, as Thomas carried her over the threshold, she felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was where she belonged. This was home. Their first months of marriage were blissful despite the challenges. Thomas continued his work as a deputy marshal, and there were times when he had to leave for days or even weeks to track outlaws or testify at trials. Each departure was difficult, each reunion joyful. Penelope continued working at the store, and she proved to have a natural head for business. Harold began to rely on her more and more, and there were quiet discussions about her eventually taking over the store when he and Margaret decided to retire. In the spring of 1877, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening after he returned from a week-long trip to Guthrie. He had been tired and dusty from the road, but when she gave him the news, his exhaustion seemed to melt away. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands gentle on her waist. "I am sure," she confirmed, smiling at his excitement. "Dr. Carson confirmed it yesterday. The baby should arrive in November." Thomas pulled her close, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered in wonder. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Penelope asked, though his expression made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Thomas said. He kissed her softly, then pulled back to look at her seriously. "I will need to talk to the marshal's office. Request assignments closer to home as you get further along. I do not want to be away when you need me. Thomas, I do not want you to compromise your work for me. You are my wife, and this is my child," Thomas said firmly. My family comes first. Always. Penelope's pregnancy progressed smoothly. She continued working at the store well into her 7th month, only stopping when Margaret and Thomas both insisted she needed to rest. Thomas kept his word about staying close to home, taking only local assignments and arranging for other deputies to handle anything that would require extended travel. He was attentive and devoted, anticipating her needs and treating her like precious cargo. On a cold November night, with the first snow of winter falling outside, Penelope went into labor. Thomas sent for Dr. Carson and Margaret, then paced the floor of their small home like a caged animal. Margaret finally banished him to the store with Harold, telling him he was making Penelope nervous. After 8 hours of labor, Penelope gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Dr. Carson finally allowed Thomas into the room, he found his wife exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Thomas approached slowly, as if afraid he might break the spell, and Penelope pulled back the blanket to show him their son. "He is perfect," Thomas breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out a finger, and the baby's tiny hand curled around it instinctively. Thomas looked at Penelope with tears streaming down his face. "You are amazing. He is amazing. I love you both so much." They named him James, after Thomas's father, and he became the center of their world. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to walk with the baby when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, and spending every free moment holding his son. Penelope watched her husband with their child and fell in love with him all over again. As James grew from an infant to a toddler, the little family settled into a comfortable rhythm. Harold officially made Penelope a partner in the store, recognizing her contributions and business acumen. Thomas accepted a promotion to senior deputy, which came with a slight increase in pay and more say in which assignments he took. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and content. When James was 2 years old, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was more difficult, with morning sickness that lasted well into the 4th month and exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Thomas worried constantly, hovering over her until she finally snapped at him to give her some space. He backed off but continued to take on more of the household duties and childcare, determined to make things easier for her. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1880, a beautiful baby girl with Penelope's dark hair and Thomas's gray-green eyes. They named her Elizabeth, and she completed their family in a way neither of them had quite anticipated. James was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her under his parents' watchful supervision. The years passed with the steady rhythm of family life. James started school and proved to be a bright, curious child who loved books almost as much as his mother did. Elizabeth grew into a spirited little girl who could wrap her father around her finger with a single smile. Thomas continued his work as a deputy marshal, but he had reached a point in his career where he could be more selective, focusing on training younger deputies and handling local matters rather than chasing outlaws across the territory. Penelope expanded the store, adding a section for books and school supplies that quickly became popular with the growing number of families in Stillwater. She also started teaching a Sunday school class at the church, finding joy in working with children and sharing the stories that had sustained her through her own difficult times. When Oklahoma became a state in 1890, there were celebrations throughout the territory. Stillwater had grown significantly over the years, and Thomas and Penelope's family had grown along with it. They now had 3 children, with a second son, William, born in 1883. The store was thriving, and Harold and Margaret had officially retired, moving into a small house on the edge of town and leaving Penelope to run the business entirely. Thomas had been offered the position of sheriff multiple times, but he had turned it down, preferring his role as deputy. He liked the flexibility it offered, the ability to focus on training and mentoring younger lawmen rather than dealing with the politics and administration that came with the sheriff's position. On a warm June evening in 1895, Thomas and Penelope sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. James was 16 now, tall and serious like his father, already talking about becoming a lawman himself. Elizabeth, at 15, was beautiful and kind, with her mother's intelligence and her father's sense of justice. William, at 12, was the wild card, full of energy and mischief, but with a heart of gold. "Can you believe it has been almost 20 years?" Penelope asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Thomas replied, wrapping his arm around her. "I can still see you sitting by that campfire, surrounded by those outlaws, refusing to show fear." "I was terrified," Penelope admitted with a laugh, "but I was trying not to let them see it. And then I came riding in like I was in some kind of dime novel," Thomas said, shaking his head at the memory. "You saved my life that night," Penelope said seriously. "You gave me a future I never thought I would have." "We gave each other that," Thomas corrected. "You saved me too, Penelope. I was lonely and married to my work, convinced that was all I would ever have. Then you came along and showed me what life could really be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. After a while, Elizabeth called out that dinner was ready, and they went inside to the warm, chaotic comfort of their family meal. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges but also deep contentment. James did indeed become a lawman, following in his father's footsteps, but forging his own path as a town marshal in a growing settlement to the west. Elizabeth married a young lawyer and moved to Oklahoma City, where she became involved in women's suffrage work, making both her parents proud. William surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, combining his mother's love of books with his natural ability to connect with children. Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1900, and Margaret followed him just 8 months later. At the funeral, Penelope cried not just for her aunt, but for her parents, for all the family she had lost and found again in different forms. Thomas held her through it all, steady as always, the rock she had leaned on for more than 2 decades. By 1905, Thomas and Penelope had 7 grandchildren, and they had officially retired from active work. They had sold the store to a young couple from Kansas, though Penelope still consulted occasionally and could not quite stay away entirely. Thomas had finally hung up his badge at the age of 55, his body still strong, but his desire for a quieter life finally overtaking his sense of duty. They spent their time traveling to visit their children and grandchildren, working in the garden behind their house and simply enjoying each other's company. They had built a good life together, a life full of love and purpose and meaning. On a warm evening in August 1907, Thomas and Penelope sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Penelope was reading aloud from a novel while Thomas whittled a toy horse for their youngest grandson. The cicadas sang in the trees, and the air smelled of honeysuckle. "Do you remember the night we met?" Thomas asked suddenly, setting down his whittling. Penelope looked up from her book and smiled. "How could I forget? You came riding out of the darkness like some kind of avenging angel." "I was just doing my job," Thomas said, but he was smiling too. "I had no idea that night would change my entire life." "Mine either," Penelope said. She closed her book and reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing as naturally as breathing. "Thank you, Thomas." "For what?" "For riding into my life that night, for staying, for building this beautiful life with me." Thomas brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the same gesture he had used the night they met. "Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life, Penelope Quinlan. Every day with you has been a gift." They sat together as the sun set, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had weathered every storm. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and endless, just as it had been on that night 31 years ago, when a cowboy had ridden in to save a woman by a campfire and found his entire future in her eyes. Their children often asked them about how they met, and Thomas and Penelope would tell the story together, finishing each other's sentences and adding details the other had forgotten. They would talk about the danger of that night, about the fear and the courage and the unlikely rescue that had brought them together. But mostly they would talk about what came after, about the days and weeks and years of choosing each other, of building a life together one small decision at a time. As the years went on, Thomas and Penelope's love story became something of a legend in Stillwater. Young couples would ask them for advice, and they would always say the same thing, that love required both passion and perseverance, that it needed to be tended like a garden, that the hard times made the good times sweeter, and that choosing each other every single day was the most important thing they could do. In 1912, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. Penelope nursed him through it with fierce determination, barely sleeping for 3 days as she fought to keep him with her. Their children came home, gathering around their parents' bed, but Penelope refused to accept that this might be the end. She held Thomas's hand and told him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the reasons he needed to stay, all the grandchildren who still needed to learn his whittling tricks, all the sunsets they had not yet watched together. Thomas pulled through, though it took him months to fully recover. During his convalescence, Penelope read to him every day, just as she had done on that porch so many years ago. They talked about their lives, about their regrets and triumphs, about the children they had raised and the love they had shared, and Thomas told her, over and over, that saving her that night had been the best decision he had ever made. By 1915, they were both in their 60s, slowing down but still vital, still engaged with life and with each other. They had 13 grandchildren now, with more on the way, and the family gatherings were loud, chaotic, and filled with love. Thomas had taught all his grandsons to ride and shoot, while Penelope had taught all her granddaughters to read and to stand up for themselves. Together, they had created a legacy that went far beyond the two of them. On their wedding anniversary each year, Thomas would take Penelope back to the hill where he had proposed, and they would sit together watching the sun set over the prairie. They would hold hands and remember that night by the campfire, the night that had changed everything, and they would give thanks for the improbable chance that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had taken a different route that night?" Penelope asked once. "If you had not heard the gunfire, if you had not ridden in?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I try not to think about it," he said honestly, "because a world without you in it is not a world I want to imagine." "I feel the same way," Penelope said softly. "You gave me everything, Thomas. A home, a family, a purpose. But most of all, you gave me love. Real, lasting, unchanging love." "We gave that to each other," Thomas said, echoing the words he had spoken so many years before. "And I would do it all again, every moment, even the hard ones, if it meant I got to spend my life with you." They grew old together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1926, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the church in Stillwater, the same church where they had married half a century before, and the entire town turned out to honor the couple who had become such an integral part of the community. During the celebration, their children asked them to tell the story of how they met one more time. Thomas and Penelope stood together at the front of the church, his arm around her waist, and told the tale they had told 100 times before. But this time, as they spoke, they looked at each other rather than at the audience, remembering not just that night, but every night that had followed, every challenge they had faced, every joy they had shared. When the story was finished, Thomas turned to Penelope and said, "You know, I have been thinking about that night a lot lately, about how scared I was when I heard those gunshots, how afraid I was that I would be too late. And then I rode into that clearing and saw you there, so brave and strong, refusing to give up even though you were outnumbered and outgunned, and I knew in that moment that I was looking at someone extraordinary." "I was just trying to survive," Penelope said, though her eyes were shining with tears. "You were doing more than surviving," Thomas insisted. "You were fighting. And you have been fighting ever since, fighting for our family, for our life together, for all the things that matter. You have been my partner in every sense of the word, and I could not be more grateful." The audience erupted in applause, and their children and grandchildren surrounded them, hugging them and thanking them for the example they had set, for showing them what real love looked like. Thomas and Penelope lived several more years after that, each day a gift they did not take for granted. They passed peacefully, within months of each other, in their late 70s, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that they had lived fully and loved completely. At Thomas's funeral, James stood at the front of the church and told the story of how his parents met. He spoke of the courage it took to ride into danger, to face unknown threats in order to protect a stranger. He spoke of the grace it took to accept help, to allow someone else to be strong for you. And he spoke of the love that had grown from that unlikely meeting, a love that had sustained two people through decades of life's challenges and joys. My father used to say that the best decision he ever made was riding toward the sound of gunfire that night, James said, his voice breaking slightly. But I think the best decision both my parents made was choosing each other every single day for 52 years. That is the real story. Not the dramatic rescue, but the daily choice to love, to stay, to build a life together. At Penelope's funeral, held just 3 months later, Elizabeth stood in the same spot and spoke of her mother's strength, her intelligence, her kindness. She spoke of how Penelope had built a life from nothing after losing everything, how she had taken the chance to love again even after knowing the pain of loss. My mother used to tell me that love was a risk worth taking, Elizabeth said, that the joy of loving someone deeply and being loved in return was worth any amount of pain or fear. She and my father proved that every day of their marriage. They showed us all what it means to truly commit to another person, to build a life together, to face the world as partners. The family gathered after the funeral at the old house where Thomas and Penelope had raised their children. As they sorted through belongings and shared memories, they found letters that their parents had written to each other over the years whenever Thomas had been away on assignment. The letters were tender and honest, full of love and longing, chronicling the deep connection that had sustained them through separations and difficulties. They also found Penelope's journal from that first year in Stillwater. In it, she had written extensively about meeting Thomas, about the rescue that had saved her life, about falling in love and building a new life from the ashes of her old one. On the last page, dated just after their wedding, she had written, "Today I married Thomas Quinlan, and I can honestly say I have never been happier. I thought I had lost everything, thought my life was over, but instead I have found something better than I ever imagined. He is strong and kind, brave and gentle, and he loves me with an intensity that still takes my breath away. Whatever the future holds, I know we will face it together. I am no longer alone, no longer adrift. I have found my home, and it is with him." James read the entry aloud to his siblings, and they all wept together, mourning their parents, but also celebrating the beautiful love story they had witnessed. Their parents had shown them what marriage could be at its best, a true partnership built on respect, trust, and deep affection. That legacy would live on in their children and grandchildren, a testament to one night when a cowboy rode into danger and found his destiny by a campfire on the Oklahoma prairie. Years later, when James's own grandchildren asked him about his parents, he would take them to the cemetery where Thomas and Penelope were buried side by side. He would tell them the story of the rescue, of the courtship, of the 52 years of marriage that followed. And he would tell them that true love was not just about the dramatic moments, though those had their place. True love was about showing up every day, choosing each other over and over, building a life together one moment at a time. The story of Thomas and Penelope became part of Stillwater's history, told and retold through generations. The spot where Thomas had proposed became a popular place for young couples to visit, and the church where they had married saw countless weddings inspired by their example. Their descendants spread across Oklahoma and beyond, carrying with them the lessons their ancestors had taught about courage, love, and commitment. In the end, Thomas and Penelope's story was not just about a dramatic rescue on a dark prairie night, though that was where it began. It was about two people who found each other at the right moment, who recognized something essential in one another, and who chose to build a life together despite uncertainty and danger. It was about the daily heroism of loving someone fully, of raising children and building a business and facing life's challenges as partners. It was about the quiet moments and the grand gestures, the laughter and the tears, the struggles and the triumphs that make up a life well lived. Their love story proved that sometimes the most important decisions we make happen in an instant, riding toward danger instead of away from it, accepting help instead of refusing it, opening our hearts instead of closing them. And sometimes those instant decisions lead to a lifetime of love, a legacy that echoes through generations, and a story worth telling again and again. Thomas and Penelope Quinlan lived fully and loved deeply, and in doing so, they created something that lasted far beyond their own years. They showed everyone who knew them that real love exists, that it is worth fighting for, and that the courage to take a chance on love can lead to the greatest adventure of all. Their story began with a rescue, but it became so much more, a testament to the enduring power of love to transform lives and create something beautiful from even the darkest moments.